So genetics is easy, right? Last week we talked about how you get half of your 46 chromosomes from your mother and the other half, the other 23, from your father. 22 sets of those chromosomes determine things like your hair color and your eye color, and if your hair is curly or straight, your skin tone, and what the shape of your fingers is. There's one set of chromosomes that determines sex. So females inherit an X from their mother and an X from their father, and males inherit an X from their mother and a Y from their father. So blend those all together and you get you. However, this doesn't tell us how traits are inherited. So you have two copies of every single allele. And how does genetics in your body determine how that set of genes is expressed? So there are two of them. Which one dominates? Which one is expressed and shown? And this applies to both things, like your hair texture and how wet or dry your earwax is, and if you can roll your tongue. But it also affects things like your propensity to disease. So it's a little bit more complicated than we made it out. To start off with, we're going to go over a quick review of our concepts from last week that continue to pertain to hereditary patterns and genetic disease. A gene is a portion of DNA. Genes code for traits, and traits are expressed through different proteins. DNA is transcribed into RNA, and RNA is then translated into protein. And so a set of nucleotide bases, so an AAGG on this gene, eventually codes for a specific protein through RNA. And that particular protein codes for traits that are phenotypically expressed. Genes have different versions called alleles. You have two versions of each gene, so two alleles for every single gene, because you have two versions of every single chromosome, one from your mom, one from your dad. And alleles, again, are versions of genes, so they code for things like traits. So a trait in this example is detached earlobes. So there are two versions of this allele. There's the version where the earlobe is attached, and there's the version where the earlobe is not attached, like in this photo. As I've said, every trait has both a phenotype and a genotype. A genotype is a set of nucleotides that then codes for RNA and then codes for a protein. So a set of adenine, adenine, guanine eventually codes for a particular protein, and that protein is phenotypically expressed in a person. But as I've tried to emphasize, you have two copies of every single gene, so you have two alleles, and how do we decide which one becomes your phenotype? Um, that is the complication and really the fun of heredity. Um, so here are a bunch of the traits we talked about last week. We have things like widow's peak, where your hairline comes down, dimples, where your face kind of goes in like this, cleft chins, predisposition to baldness, freckles, rolled tongues, hitchhiker's thumbs, all kinds of traits like this. And these traits are pretty simple. Um, they're largely called monogenic. Some of them are a little debated, but for the sake of argument, they're all monogenic. And that means that the traits are controlled by one gene. So, for instance, the relative wetness or dryness of your earwax is determined by a single nucleotide. So, one change in one nucleotide um, ends up coding for a different protein, and that different protein individually determines how wet or dry your earwax is. And as we will be talking about, you inherit one copy of that earwax gene from your mom and one copy of your earwax gene from your dad, and they can either match or they can not match. Most genes are not monogenic forever. Most genes are polygenic. So mono, as you may know, means one gene. So one gene determines the outcome. Other genes are polygenic, which means that a trait is controlled by many, many genes. So these include a lot of complicated factors. So, for instance, how likely you are to become obese is determined by many different factors. Things like skin color are determined by many different genes that are all interacting with one another. It's not just one gene. And for the purposes of today, we're going to be assuming that the diseases and traits we're talking about are monogenic. That is, they only have one gene that determines them, because if you end up talking about, say, you have 50 genes that we all know contribute to one singular trait, then you have to look at 50 alleles from your mom and 50 alleles from your dad, and there may be crossover. There's a lot of complications. So we're just going to assume that the traits that we're talking about are determined by one single gene that has two different alleles that it can be. Additionally, it's important to point out that not all of our DNA codes for genes. A lot of our DNA is non-coding regions. And additionally, we don't know what a lot of our genes do. So it's possible that more portions of our DNA are doing things, and that we just don't know, because it's really kind of impossible to experiment on this stuff in humans. You can't just delete genes from people. We can delete them from, say, flies or mice and see what happens. But for, and that gives us some information, but for humans, we have to rely largely on bioinformatics and things like the Human Genome Project to figure out exactly what our genes do. So there's still a lot of work to be done in this area to understand exactly how all of the proteins in your body are coded for in your DNA. So to start off, we've got to understand the difference between dominant and recessive traits. So on the left, you have a normal thumb or a straight thumb, and that is a dominant trait. And on the right, you have a hitchhiker's thumb, which is curved back like this, and is how people would hitchhike. Back in the day, don't hitchhike, it's dangerous. And so a normal thumb, a straight thumb like this, is a dominant trait. That means that if someone inherits both a copy of a normal thumb from one parent and a copy of a hitchhiker's thumb from another parent, then the normal thumb will mask or dominate over the hitchhiker's thumb. And so their progeny would have this normal thumb. And we're going to go over this in quite a bit of detail. A hitchhiker's thumb is a trait that is a recessive trait that can be masked. So it is dominated by this dominant thumb. It's also important to remember that disease states can be either dominant or recessive. We can talk about that in a little bit. We're also assuming right now that all of the traits and diseases that we're talking about are autosomal. That is, that they are not connected to sex. And so they're coded for on the 22 sets of chromosomes that are not sex linked. So, say like chromosome 11 is a somatic chromosome, and that means that it is not sex determining. It's not either the X or Y chromosomes. So we're also assuming that these could come from either parent, and it doesn't really matter because they're the same. A copy of one of a parent's two chromosomes is passed randomly to their offspring. And this is what we mean when we say that you share 25% of your chromosomes with your grandparents and 50% with your parents, because you are just as likely to get either copy of your parents' two chromosomes. And since you're just as likely to get either copy of your parents' two chromosomes, you're just as likely to get either of your parents' chromosomes that come from either of their parents. And so you're 25% likely to get a chromosome that originally came from your maternal grandmother or maternal grandfather, as well as your paternal grandmother and paternal grandfather. So you have a 25% chance of getting a gene that is passed from either of them. And of course, you can go on and on and on. You have 1/8 chance of getting any particular chromosome from that was originally from your great grandparent. And of course, this is kind of glossing over crossing over that can happen and promoting to genetic diversity, but on a basic level, that is how genes are passed. So there's no differential chance of getting either of your parents' two chromosomes. It's entirely random. It's a 50-50 chance for every single chromosome. So you always have two copies. one from each parent, but which copy you get is random. So you can have homozygous alleles, that is having the same allele of a trait from both parents. So say your parents both have wet earwax and you get two wet earwax alleles. You inherit a wet earwax allele from your mom and a wet earwax allele from your dad. This is an example of homozygous because homo means same, and zygous means egg, which isn't super useful here. But it's the same allele from both of the parents. In comparison to a heterozygous, so hetero means different, and so you have different alleles from each of your parents. So say you inherit a wet earwax allele from your dad and a dry earwax allele from your mom. This would be a heterozygous state. So homozygous, having the same alleles, and a heterozygous, different alleles. People can be have homozygous for both dominant and recessive traits. And we're going to see that in an example in just a minute. So let's actually dive into an example. So parent 1 in this example has normal thumbs in comparison to parent 2 has had hitchhiker thumb. And so parent 1's normal thumb is a result of two normal thumb alleles. In this case, we know that normal thumb alleles are dominant. And parent 2's hitchhiker thumb is, as we'd expect, the result of two hitchhiker alleles because they need two hitchhiker alleles to have a hitchhiker thumb because it's a recessive trait. So parent 1 is only going to pass on normal thumb alleles, and parent 2 is only going to pass on hitchhiker alleles. So if we make a Punnett square, which is this chart that helps us determine what kind of progeny two parents are going to have, we have two big N's over here, so two dominant normal alleles from parent number 1, and up here we have two recessive hitchhiker alleles from parent number 2. So, and again, these can be either a mom or dad, it does not matter. So here we have a big N coming from here and a little N coming from here, giving us a heterozygous state. And the same here, and same here, because a parent number 1 can only give a normal thumb big N allele, and parent 2 up here can only give little N hitchhiker's thumb allele. And so 100% of these progeny of the next generation are heterozygous. And given that we know that thumb relative straightness is a homozygous or is a dominant